I'd like to thank you very much, Merit, Sarina, Alfred, and Beth, for the extremely rich and interesting discussion that we just had. And we learned a lot already from co-production, I think, but this session is intended to learn more. And we will now listen to maybe another perspective, looking from the practitioner's side, and again trying to localize the doing that has been done into the different context of, in this case, Greater Manchester, Cape Town, Kisumu, and Gothenburg. So we will listen to some specific examples of how the implementation of co-produced research has proceeded. And we will also hear about the role of co-production in opening spaces for community participation in the decision-making and policy formation. So our three panelists all come from the public sector, and our chair, Alex Winnan, is, as he describes himself, a lifelong volunteer. So Alex is the chief executive of GMCVO, which is the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation. Alex has been leading GMCVO since 2003, developing it into a very well-connected, sustainable organization with a national reputation. And prior to this, he has a long experience of working within the field of social housing in different associations and organizations. He's also a trustee of London Voluntary Services Council and an amateur musician. I suppose, Alex, you will speak about GMCVO, but in short, it's a voluntary community and social enterprise sector support. It brings added value as it operates in territories where the state and the market cannot or shouldn't act, hereby increasing the diversity of voices that are heard. GMCVO has also an important role in the practical testing of new ideas on the basis of test, learn, and share. So welcome, all of you. Yeah.
Much. So, as you see, we've had some slight troubles with the panel today. So the panel is not as you had it on your programs, but I'm going to get around that by asking my panelists to introduce themselves in a moment in more detail than I possibly could. Our question today was, what have we learned from co-production so far? And particularly, what have we learned by trying to co-produce across different sectors? And I think the session before started to touch on that a little bit, but I've been told that they were warned to save the warts for us. We get all the difficult bits. Just reflecting on what we've heard already today, I'm very interested in the question of power, because obviously, coming from the background I do, we're aware that everyone has power, actually. They may just not know that they do. And privilege determines whether or not you can execute that power. I'm also very taken by the idea that if co-production is very difficult, as seems to be acknowledged, then it must be a good thing to do. Because my experience is that the easy solutions to everything generally don't work. So a little bit more really about GMCVO, my own organisation. So we're a civil society organisation. How many other people are here today from civil society organisations? A few. Okay. So good. Thank you for being here. Be quite interested in your comments afterwards. I think it's probably slightly more difficult for civil society to get involved in this kind of co-production than it even is for the public sector or the private sector, but we'll find out. My own organisation, GMCVO, it gets described all sorts of different ways. Here are some examples of how we're described. So some people say, oh, you're a think tank that does things. We've been described as an intermediary body between the voluntary community and social enterprise sector and the rest of the world, whoever that is, because pretty much we are the world, I think. We've been described as a dating agency, which I quite like, actually, bringing people together who wouldn't otherwise meet and finding that they might get on quite well. And we've been described by another university, actually, the University of Bristol, as a facilitator of networks. So we're all sorts of things to all people. In this context, we are one of the partners to the Greater Manchester Local Interaction Platform, and we are an equal partner in a particular project. And I'll talk a little more about that in a moment, but it's quite interesting being a formal co-practitioner on an academic project. So the slide behind you, if I change the slide, we'll see it. Sorry, other way. There we are. Okay. That's quite an interesting slide. I'm not going to even go there. Your first impression will be that this is very, very complicated. It is. This is the process by which our city, Greater Manchester, has been progressing towards the idea of a devolved city with more autonomy from central government. The vision that you see set out behind you is a vision driven by the city leaders, not even necessarily by all of local government, but by the city leaders. And only by them, really, with the rest of us hanging on the coattails. There's an interesting paradox in our city, which is that it is very, very successful in every term. It is the second largest economy in England outside London, international reputation for all sorts of things, and yet the vision of the city leaders that all of the residents should share in the prosperity of the city has spectacularly failed to be realised, and actually things have got worse and worse and worse, and now they're really, really bad. So my first involvement with Mistra through the group working in Greater Manchester was an invitation from Beth to produce one of a number of essays that she was commissioning from people right across the city, from all sorts of different backgrounds, a lot of civil society organisations as well as the public and private sector. And what was really interesting when we all handed our essays in was that there was no sense of any kind of shared vision or shared sense of priority in what we meant by a sustainable or a just city. Really very little overlap. And I think the problem we have is this lack of a shared vision, which came up very, very strongly in Henrietta's word search at the very beginning. We've gone on to do more work with Mistra. We were involved in a piece of research with community hubs that Beth referred to, where GMCVO made the relationships with the community hubs, and we undertook some of the work, and we produced a very interesting piece of research showing what does and doesn't make a successful community hub or third space. We're now an equal partner in the Jam and Justice project, which is looking at how do you create more inclusive governance in a devolved city region. And I think what we're doing here is we're inviting different people to the conversation. We really are. We're inviting all the people who might have a stake in what the city might be like to be involved somehow in the governance of the city. It's going to be very difficult indeed. So we're going to start talking about the learning in a moment. What I've learned personally so far, before I hand over to colleagues, is it feels very good to be involved with Mistra compared with many of the other relationships we've had with universities over the years, and we've been doing it for years. We're an equal partner. We're actually receiving some of the funding, and we feel like we have equal status in the project, and that's really empowering, actually. It is extremely difficult. I find that our academic partners literally speak a different language, and that we have to translate all the time into, well, what does that mean in third sector civil society speech? That's been very challenging, and I really relate to the people in the last panel who said it takes quite a lot of time just to get the measure of each other. But on a very practical level, again, valuing the contribution of academics, I have personally learnt some really, really useful and interesting bits of theory from academics, difficult concepts about how do you understand things and how do you evaluate things, which have been incredibly useful to me in my own day job. So it cuts both ways. And I think I would absolutely agree with the people on the previous panel who say it does get better as you go along. But we're going to talk more as a group about what we all have learned from the experience. And I'm going to start now by inviting each of the three speakers to give a very briefly just who they are, what their project was about, just so we know who everybody is, because I've barely had a chance to speak to them myself. And then we're going to go on to look at the question. So I'll come back to you and start asking you what have you learned and try to tease that apart for you in a moment. We'll open up to the audience after that if anyone has reflections or comments that you want to make. And then we'll wrap up by trying to summarize what the session has taught us all. I'll try anyway. So, Klaus, you're the first, I think, and you should be the best prepared because at least you're one of the original panelists.
No pressure. I first just want to... Oh, this is not this one.
No, it's not
there we go. I first want to lodge a grievance with Beth. I don't know if we're supposed to be the fat cats. I will say that I like cats, and feline obesity is a real thing. So you got to... Yeah, I just want to say before I begin, we represent a particular sector. I'm in the public sector. I'm a bureaucrat, and I thought about, given that we're coming off a back foot already, starting, how do I ingratiate myself with my hosts? So I can either make a Volvo joke or an Ingmar Bergman joke, and I figured I really don't know a movie line from Ingmar Bergman that isn't too gloomy for this kind of conference. But for some of you, I would imagine listening to a government bureaucrat talking about innovation in the closing hours of a conference does evoke themes of human isolation and death. But hopefully, I had to tell that joke because I'm nervous. Okay, was that 4 minutes now gone?
You're all right.
So I was very grateful that Deborah and also Warren raised some of the issues pertinent to Cape Town and cities in South Africa. I don't have to go through those again. I would say something quite provocative, though, that in trying to intervene in these very difficult, intractable problems, people involved in the design of policy and the testing and refinement of policy, we are not served by the prevailing policy language that was introduced after democracy in 1994. These words intentionally are void of any kind of settled meaning, which serves its purpose as a blank canvas where a conflicted society and individuals, academics of different intellectual schools can project their own aspirations and needs onto these nebulous terms. That serves it's useful in what it aimed to achieve, but when it comes to people on the ground, the people in the trenches, as Deborah referred to as the mechanics, we are not served by the nebulous nature of these terms, because we can talk about having a plurality of interpretations for these words, but at the end of the day, there is something called how do you solve the principal-agent problem in a complex society, in a complex, large organization? You need indicators. You need to break it down to numbers. And it's an awful thing, and I know it's anathema in a lot of sectors, but we cannot proceed without it. What happens when there is no settled meaning in our policy imperatives? Well, I can tell you that in the case of South Africa, I can't tell you how well we've been doing in terms of our policies, and specifically in terms of our place-based policies, because our policies cannot be evaluated. There's no systematic way of evaluating the effectiveness of our policies. So it is when I'm moving on to what I do. My name is Klaus. I work for the city of Cape Town in the planning department, and what we have done is, in this morass of vagueness, we have gone out there, recognized the immediate urgency to address and to have action at the local level, and to do so, we developed internally, as an experiment, an agnostic model. It is not tied to any set of particular policy prescriptions or national world sustainability goals. It is not benchmarked. It doesn't meet any kind of rigorous scientific standard, but we created a common language with which we could engage and share data with local stakeholders, with companies, with universities, and we did so by using a learning by doing approach. That worked very well. This kind of cowboy economics worked very well in having people sit around a table, being able to understand how, in this case, how their neighborhoods are doing relative to other neighborhoods. What are how can you understand the local problems in a regional context in terms of citywide trends? Because these neighborhoods are not islands in space, they're all interconnected. And one can say that information is power, but I can tell you that in a place like South Africa, in Cape Town, information asymmetry, which is very prevalent, actually disempowers communities from engaging not only with the city in terms of motivating for interventions, but also engaging with business, etc. So that's what we did. We spent 2 years, I'm going to get to the end now, we spent 2 years collecting all the existing administrative data, the spatial data that the city is gathering as part, using basically as byproduct of its administrative processes. We built a model, we tested it, it went well, everyone understood how it worked, and then by means of the Mistra exchange program, we could actually elevate this entire program. We did not want to spend budget, because once you spend budget, you start attracting political attention and your project ceases to be agnostic and experimental in our context. So it was extremely effective, and I can say that after going through Mistra, having published the work, having codified it to some extent, having settled on definitions, having settled on the structure of indicators and how they interact with one another, I can say that we have had fantastic response. Not only has it been mainstreamed within the city, but National Treasury has now actually embedded that method into the standard national guidelines for how cities are supposed to report in order to access grant funding. So it's actually being able to wide scale, being able to upscale, requires a settled definition, a settled scale, a means of measuring, a means of packaging and replicating. And in a context, and this is my last point, in the context of a place like South Africa, not unlike many other places, where there isn't a tradition of evidence-based public sector research, it is, and coupled with increasing resource scarcity, that to me is a massive waste, and I don't think we should sacrifice all the local innovation that's happening at the ground level in the public sector in South Africa on the altar of formal science. I think we need to proceed, and I think everyone has their role. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm now going to introduce Samuel Kelo, who is from Kisumu, who is very kindly standing in. I don't know where you're from, so you'll have to explain a little more about yourself. I'm sorry.
Thank you. As you've heard, Samuel Kelo from Kisumu Local Interaction Platform and former mayor of Kisumu, standing in for Mudhoni. But what I would like to say is the city of Kisumu offers space. It's the operations theater of all these ideas, grand ideas that are researched, and gives us opportunity, especially working closely with the local platform and other platforms to give opportunities for exchange of students, for example, from here. And we've gained immensely because we have, through the new constitution and the courtesy of the county government, we have what is called a consultative process of decision-making. First of all, consultative planning, consultative budget process. All these things are quite useful because they involve the public. But they involve the public. At the same time, through CLIP, we have the private sector, academia, civil society, and the city itself. So the city is involved and gains immensely from that experience and the academic input, while at the same time working with the masses, the public that enjoy the services. So this process of consultation is quite important for us because there's ownership. It's a little longer, but it's good because already we've established that platform. And through the interaction platform, Kisumu has been involved in two flagship projects, that is ecotourism and marketplaces. And this directly involved the local population. They involved the local universities. Jaramogi University was involved in ecotourism. Maseno University was involved in marketplaces. But what happens is the city, in its normal process, has attracted funding and projects. But we have, for example, the AFD program to deal with the city renewal. But with these new processes on the local interaction platform, with the consultative process of budgetary processes, you then get a forum and you get training and you get sessions in which local interaction platform has brought in the public together, so that as opposed to only dealing with academic issues or marketplaces and other issues, and you then deal with holistic issues that deal with development of the city. Creating forums, annual forums, for example, there was Fish Night, Kisumu is on the lake, Fish Night, Adunga, for example, involving the fish folks and all that. And then there's every program that is a 4 billion euro project, but CLIP then advises the whole process. They sit in the steering committee, for example, so that things are discussed objectively and there's buy-in. So we're not only talking about things that are illusionary, but actually practical things that we've done. And this process of critically understanding and involving people and the merits and demerits of everything else is actually working practically in Kisumu, because they are running projects at the moment like building schools, building markets, understanding why World Bank did build markets of which have never been used in 20 years' time, because they never consulted anybody, and the traders trade out of the markets. There are about 4 of them. There are some health facilities that were built. They were built because the people didn't ask for them, but somebody somewhere thought this was development that the city needed. But in the current form, the consultative process, there's a buy-in, the civil society are involved, they call meetings, and people are involved in the discussion and the design so that people feel part of the process. So this kind of knowledge-based research and investment we find is more productive. And we are so forever grateful that through Kisumu Action Team, Kisumu Local Interaction Platform now, we've been able to attract funding into the city through Kisumu Local Interaction Platform that actually has had organized what you call open days for the city, where people come in and discuss the city they want, and is very productive. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and our last speaker is Per Christensen, who is also a stand-in, I'm afraid, from Gothenburg. But again, maybe you could explain a little more about yourself, please.
Yeah, right now I wish I wasn't sitting here between somebody that had been able to prepare himself and a politician or former. In fact, I'm just a regional planner for some years. Yeah. And in another way, I would wish that, and I was given this brief, and I wish that I had beside me one of the politicians from one of the local municipalities that could explain the story about this. But as I haven't got either, or all 3 options, I have to do it myself, as an activist. Wasn't that the point you should be? Right? John said before that there are sort of 10 basic issues or challenges. You put up a slide, and that is about housing, infrastructure, climate change, and what have you. And we've been dealing with regional planning for 75 years last year. So we should know how to do a regional plan. And we have been doing regional plans, 3 of them. And we had the experience that regional planning in a traditional way, where civil servants do the planning. Of course, they have a brief of something, do maps and stuff that you usually do. And then it's taken up to a political decision afterwards. Wasn't that beneficial for implementation? So when we were supposed to do the 4th regional plan, we said we would prefer to do regional planning. And what is that? Well, we had a gut feeling. This is 1999, 2000, so it's a few years ago. I've been around a long time. We had a gut feeling that we have to involve the politicians, because the alternative would be doing a lot of work ourselves. And we thought it was much better to involve the politicians so that they could get involved in the process. And that's what we did. We decided, or our politicians decided, to have what we call consultation round, where our politicians goes out to all the municipality, the assembly of every municipality, in total 1,100 politicians, and start talking about regional planning. The first consultation round was 2001, started, and that was a question: what is regional planning? What issues can't be solved on the local level in your municipality? What has to be done on the regional level? And surprise, they came up with housing, infrastructure, water treatment, refuge, which of course we could have written down on a piece of paper and told them, we'll take over these questions so you can sit back as civil servants. I don't think that would have been effective, so that's why we did this. So that was the first consultation round, a discussion that went on for a couple of years to reach all the local municipality assembly. The second consultation round, a year later, was how should we work on these regional issues? And of course, our reason for doing this was to create a learning process. What is regional planning? And after the second round, and the same politicians, I think actually we had, did we have a general election in between there? Doesn't matter, but it was building trust in the process of the issue. The third consultation round, the politicians set out targets and regional agreements that should be met. They said, let's create a structural illustration. And nobody really knew what a structural illustration was. It was a sketch of something. Some people will say it was a regional plan. If we had started with that, we wouldn't got so far. And the third consultation round also said, let's be that the board of GR, our institution, should be responsible for the public transport program, sort of a sideline, but they took it upon themselves instead of the public transport company. They took upon it to politically steer a public transport program, development of that. And they said this about this structural illustration. They also said that we should have a target for the population growth, that we should have a target where the growth should be, and et cetera, et cetera. Fourth consultation round, we put this forward. And that wasn't a strange thing then. This was accepted. And the reason for having this was that it should take into account all the climate change issues, and we had regional agreements on each thing. What you see here is the core center of the region, the red bit. That's the core center of Gothenburg town. And then the agglomeration around that, that's the orange, and then the transport corridors with nodes, etc. And the green wedges, special regional agreements around that. The blue thing is the archipelago and the coastal line, and then there's a blue line through, that's the river that runs through. We had all regional agreements around this, and that's where we are. You can click the thingamy. So creating this structural illustration on the regional level and the regional agreements meant that the implementation of this in each local municipality was done as such. Like this is one municipality north of Gothenburg, and they said, yes, we will develop the region. We will support the structural illustration of the whole region, and we will support it, and we will make sure that our development is in line. So we empowered the local municipality and the politicians to implement the regional construction. I thought that was quite good. This also meant that we had created an arena where politicians all over the region had trust in the system of working together, and that's a cooperation. And also, they were able to. This is done 2009, so the process is long and takes time, but it's very effective. It also enabled the same politicians not to have an argument about introducing something that's so welcome in every region, such as congestion tax. Politically, no argument. And that is something that we could discuss at length. They missed the thing about participatory planning involving the public sector. So there was some discontent about the congestion tax. I'll finish that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I think there's some common agreement between all of us that in the sense that the process of co-producing whatever it is and the involvement of the right people, the stakeholders in it, is really, really important. So my question to you all now really is, in the processes that you've been through, what do you think you would do the same in a different context? What do you think you would advise people to do differently? Can I start with you, Klaus?
Sure. Thank you. I think, well, it's actually happening. I don't have to speculate or immerse myself in that situation. We are getting. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Oh, yeah. We are getting because of the I don't want to talk about the success, but the attention that this thing has attracted, this work that we're doing. We are getting phone calls from eThekwini, from Joburg. These are other cities in South Africa. In Tshwane is saying, could you do the same here? And we're talking now about replication. And I say to them, and this is the tricky part, is the public sector can, because we don't have a tradition of evidence-based public research, the public sector cannot outsource the leadership that is required within the public sector to create distance between the researcher, if you want to call it that, or the research team, and the day-to-day vagaries of working in a local government context. That space can only happen if the right leadership that's a precondition before Mistra, before any engagement, but because the idea and the innovation happens through necessity, and it needs to curate, it needs to incubate, and only once that is established, once you have been given a wide berth, then you have to bring on your partners. That was my experience. The second point that I wanted to make, and this is also something which I make very clear, when we say we cannot outsource the space to create and to innovate, at the same time, that means we need to design our methodologies in a way that avoids the need of budget. What do I mean by that? I mean that we are sitting, and this, if we talk about co-production, we have for the first time the technological means to draw from existing data sources and make the most of them. And don't get caught up in minutiae about how these indicators are constructed. Move forward, test them, refine them in an iterative way. Ground truth them with local community members and local structures. Test them against, for example, business location theory by means of Mistra. But do not set up a methodology that before you even left the room, you need to conduct primary research with your special indicators that you got from Brussels or wherever else. Because you're shooting yourself in the foot, and you become seen by the political bean counters. And they start to say, how is this supporting their political agenda? Because I can tell you what happens is once they leave, once it becomes a pet project, and the politicians will change, then it's gone. And it's over, and it has not been systematized. So that's the one point that the last point I wanted to make. And I also have to make one more very important point. And I will stop there. I've flown a really long way, so here we go. I want to also really make the point that we have to understand and we have to appreciate that when we talk about, it's important that words are not definable because it allows for a plurality of voices. If you're in a highly unequal society, that just means that there are power brokers at the local level that have slightly more access to information, and they set the narrative. And they don't set the narrative in a way that couches the local problem in terms of a regional issue or a broader issue. It is in their interest to use the information that they have access to couch the problem as local, and that it creates the space for them to get allocative preference from national or from the metropolitan city. So I don't agree with the view that plurality or loose definitions open the doors to democracy. I don't think it's that simple, given certain pre-existing societal conditions.
Okay. Thank you. Sam, what would you do the same and what would you do differently?
What couldn't change is the consultative process. Consultative planning, there's no substitute to that. That stays. But what probably could be done slightly differently is that in the instance of Kisumu for now, we're operating with 2 universities as the lead, but there are about 8 universities in the city. So inclusivity is key here. Therefore, CLIP can mature, working with the city to create a platform, an organization or a platform through which it's a research center and a center that everyone meets, so that it's not at the exclusion of other centers. Because at the moment, we're working with 2 great universities, but there are about 6 left out. So if we could have a standalone, or through the city have a standalone facility that all the universities come together to operate from, led by maybe what is already having through the trust, that would be the greatest thing that we would do differently. Thank you.
Thank you.
What we're talking about is in the Gothenburg region is regional governance or multi-level steering. And early on in the process, we had a metaphor that we discussed, and that was, when you have a birthday party, you have a big cake, and everybody could want a bigger piece. And we shifted that discussion to create, can we decide to, for next party, have a bigger cake and everybody get a bigger share? That's a classic. And that means that we, instead of going by prognosis, the future will be so and so and so, and we have to react to that, we said, and that is why we in the consultation round 3 had set up very strict targets where we want to go. We decide, or the politicians decide, what the future should be, where we should be in 10 years, 20 years. Very early on in the process, we had a discussion internally, and my boss at the time said, I'm not sure about all these discussions and things. I think we need some professional to come and talk to us. So he brought down a professor from Stockholm, which is then a very important person, and we were explaining what we wanted to do and sketching. We started off not knowing that we would have 4 consultation rounds and then a 5th one. We only knew that we wanted to do things differently than a traditional way. And he started sketching on a piece of paper, writing formulas, etc. And then he said, yes, this can be done. It's called endogen developing theory instead of exogen. Endogen, you decide yourself where you want to go and decide what is needed to create that future. And exogen is, you look around, well, we have grants from the government, we have this, and then we have that, we have to make sure that we fulfill other stakeholders' needs and wants. So we went endogen, and that is creating the bigger cake instead of just complaining to the government, nobody's looking after us. What we would do differently, I think that now we just involve the politicians on the local and regional level. I think it would be better to have included also even more stakeholders, but I mean, look, it's almost 20 years ago. We would have had more organizations. Mistra Urban Futures didn't exist. And possibly we should have involved the public as well, because that would have been a much longer journey, much more difficult, but we would have set what kind of region do we want to live in, we being everybody living here, every organization being involved in the process. And that decision, that knowledge would have made life a lot easier now when we have quite a big difference between what the civil society wants and the public. So we would involve more talks.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much indeed. I'm wondering whether there are people out here who have got comments or questions on what you've heard so far. There's a hand up the back there. There's a few hands up. This one. All right, would you like to start since you've got the microphone? Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
I'm Barbara Ekström from the city of Gothenburg. I work with social perspectives and culture. And I have a question for the panel. The situation in Gothenburg is that the politicians are quite aware of the benefits of co-production. And we have a vision for the development of the city of Gothenburg, and it's a good one. It really wants the citizens to create the city together with all other interests. But the problem is that we now have invited the citizens to sort of bake the bigger cake together with us. But the system in Gothenburg with the social servants and things like that is still the same. So I would like to have some ideas of how an organization is constructed that really benefits the development of co-production, who can take care of all the good cake bakers. Because the way I see it, it takes a huge structure to take care of all the good initiatives.
Okay. Anyone want to have a go?
I suppose to answer that. I think that it's important to not come with a solution before the function you want to create. I think it's so. First decide, do you want to have participatory planning, and then how will we do that? And then you come to some sort of solution. Just for the people from Gothenburg, we had a congestion tax. We had some problem in Backa area, and we had a huge process how to involve the participants, the public people and all other different stakeholders in that area, and we created a really nice procedure around that. Perspective planning, having different perspectives methodically to bring in all the different stakeholders in the process. That is another discussion.
I think my immediate reflection on hearing your question was the analogy with the recent vote in England on whether we should leave or stay in the EU. And what seems to me is it's very, very important that the cake bakers are given the knowledge that they need to bake the cake, because if you don't have a recipe and you just chuck some ingredients around, you might come out with a result you didn't really like. And certainly the Jam and Justice project that we're now involved with, one of the aspects of that is that we are bringing in people from the community to design research and then deliver research on a practical, community-based level. But we're making sure that they have the tools that they need to do the job and that they understand what we're trying to do and why. And I think that's really important. Either of the other people want to say anything about that, or no? Because we have a number of other questions. There was one up there. Have you managed to get it working?
Hi, I think so, yes. Hi, I'm Rika from the Cape Town
down here.
Mistra. I've got a question that refers back to the session earlier this morning, just around the definitions of justice. So a lot of what's being spoken about is around around justice, but maybe a justice or justities is not the explicit way that it's spoken about. So I was wondering, the first part of the question is around the terminology that's used to describe or define what a just city vision is within your experience. And secondly, it's often much easier to work with universities in a sense, but what happens with co-producing with activists or with advocacy groups where definitions of justice or just cities or visions of justice or justice cities can be very, very different. And how in your context do you work with those kinds of very volatile issues that sometimes seem to have a different logic to the imperatives of bureaucracy?
Oh, thank you. You sound like you have a...
Well, it's an interesting point, because the point was made earlier that why can't we have vague terms? Think about law, think about justice. Well, who arbitrates law? It's a judge. There's no consensus. It's a wise man with a beard, or woman. So it's interesting to me that example was raised. On the point of the activists, I'll be frank, we've had a rough ride in Cape Town. Maybe our activists in Cape Town are waking up to the sort of the robust critique that you find elsewhere. So we are still finding our feet. Before, civil society was, I would believe, more pragmatic, and now they've become more radical. And it becomes difficult when we're all saying the same words like transformation and inclusion, but without a definition, as was mentioned earlier, there's a great range of what that might actually entail when it comes down to policy. So I think it's a challenge, and I definitely don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, in our instance, we brought in the civil society to work with them because it's a requirement. One thing is the public trusts them more than organizations. The public would trust the voice of the civil society on a project more than city, county, or the national government, because they've been working closely together and they have been championing their interests to the table. Therefore, bringing them on board, and as we have, I think Betty Okero should have been here, she represents civil society network into the clipboard. Now, that voice goes back and discusses. When it comes to public participation, we give them that slot to bring people without vetting so that they're able to attend seminars and conferences, so that they're sure, they're more convinced that we are not doctoring anything, but their voice is heard. Once there's confidence building in that process, it takes a while. Once that process there, people feel represented, I think that is the way to go. It's a little longer. They could be very rough because they have to stand their ground too, but I think it's a voice that we cannot ignore. They're more trusted with the public in our instance. Therefore, the only way to do is inclusivity.
Thank you. Sorry,
I think that the biggest challenge we have is to be able to keep the kind of co-production over time, to keep that question alive. We have elections every 4 years. There are new politicians. The politicians that was taking the structural illustration, that's 7 years ago. The actual sustainable development document is 10 years ago. There are different politicians now. They don't own the question. So that we have to address how to keep people involved in the process over time.
Okay, thank you. Question at the front.
Thank you. My name is Jack Ranguma. I'm from Kisumu. I'm the first governor of Kisumu County, where Kisumu City is situated. And you already know that the Kisumu Interaction Platform has been incorporated in our programs as a county, because I think it is important that we relate and get solutions working together. I am very, very impressed by the discourse going on here, because I think it is this principle of co-production is very, very important. And in my view, it is the way to go. It is the only way that can bring people to bring solutions to problems early, and to ensure that everybody is brought on board. The idea of academia in the past, working alone, I think should be left aside, and they be allowed to be part of a system that brings solutions based on research, and then to influence policy of government. Because if they do, then we can see real progress. Now, but I want to say at this stage, at the onset, that yes, there should be 4 groups. There is the academia, there is the practitioner, there's also the civil society organizations, but I think the people are also critical on their own. And the Constitution of Kenya 2010 requires that every policy that we adopt and implement must be approved by the people directly through a civic participation program. And this, I think, brings the people on board, including the academia as individuals. But even though that is the situation, there is this other angle, which I think is also critical. That as a politician, I became a governor on the basis of my promises. And you must appreciate that those promises were made before I was aware of Kisumu Local Interaction Platform. And to incorporate them on board in the beginning was a serious soul-searching initiative that I think has come to bear fruits in my view. And the reason why I'm bringing it here is because going forward, under the principle of co-production, how do you influence political intervention at this early stage? I know you did this, but because it is important to do that early. Not every politician is like me. There are others who would have moved in a different direction, but I think we feel that it is important that we find a way of bringing them on board early, so that then they are able to appreciate and to appreciate the principle of co-production because it is good. Finally,
I'm sorry, I have
the
to stop
university should also have a similar program of ensuring that the principle of co-production continues in all departments. you should produce graduates that are relevant and research that is consistent with the requirements of society.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry we have to bring it to a halt very quickly. I want to ask my panelists to say in one sentence, just in one sentence, please, to sum up, what's the most important thing you've learned? No? One thing, one word.
One sentence.
One word?
Are we negotiating?
No, we're out of time, so a short
Well,
sentence.
the public sector, as public officials, we must not abrogate our role in terms of asking the question in the innovation game. We have the data, we have the policy questions, we have the relevance, but we need the knowledge that sits in universities, and we need to bridge that divide. We need each other.
Good, thank you. Okay, Sam.
Final word.
Open door policy, welcome all ideas, sit down and crystallize them.
Thank you.
I think the key question is how to keep the kettle boiling. You need fuel, water, and a kettle. In other words, you need involvement, content, and a framework.
Thank you very much to all our panelists.